Deep in the spring of 1710, on the banks of the Dniester River in the fortress town of Bender, a group of exhausted Cossack officers, diplomats, and warriors gathered under the shadow of catastrophe. They had lost everything: their homeland, their wealth, their military strongholds, and their legendary leader, Hetman Ivan Mazepa, who had died just months after their tragic defeat at the Battle of Poltava. Before them stood a daunting choice: surrender to the iron grip of Tsar Peter the Great, or continue an apparently hopeless struggle in foreign exile. On April 16, 1710, they chose the latter. But instead of simply electing a new military commander to lead their broken ranks, they did something utterly unprecedented in European history. Before Pylyp Orlyk took his oath as the new hetman in exile, he was presented with a document that would redefine the relationship between a ruler and his people. It was called Pacts and Constitutions of Rights and Freedoms of the Zaporozhian Host. Written 38 years before Montesquieu published The Spirit of the Laws and nearly 8 decades before the United States Constitution or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, this extraordinary document laid down the principles of a modern constitutional republic. It restricted the power of the ruler, established a 3-branch system of government, created an independent judiciary, protected social rights, and declared that sovereignty belonged not to a monarch, but to the people. Yet for centuries, this monumental achievement was buried under the weight of imperial propaganda and Cold War obscurity. The man behind it, Pylyp Orlyk, spent the remaining 32 years of his life wandering across the courts of Europe. From Stockholm to Istanbul, from Dresden to Thessaloniki, living in poverty, constantly hunted by Russian assassins, yet never abandoning his crusade for a free Ukraine governed by the rule of law. This is the story of Pylyp Orlyk, the visionaries of Bender, and the birth of one of Europe's first constitutions. To understand how such an advanced political document emerged among the Cossacks of the early 18th century, one must look at the unique culture of the Cossack hetmanate and the intellectual background of Pylyp Orlyk himself. Born in 1672 in the village of Cossack, in modern-day Belarus, Orlyk hailed from a noble family of Czech-Lithuanian heritage. His early life was marked by rigorous academic training. He entered the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, the premier center of higher learning and intellectual life in Eastern Europe at the time. There, under the tutelage of Europe's finest scholars, Orlyk mastered multiple languages, including Latin, Old Church Slavonic, Polish, High German, and Swedish, while absorbing classical philosophy, Roman law, theology, and European political theory. Orlyk's intellectual brilliance and administrative genius did not go unnoticed. He caught the attention of Ivan Mazepa, the Grand Hetman of Ukraine, who appointed him General Chancellor, effectively making him the Secretary of State and head of foreign policy for the Hetmanate. For years, Orlyk worked at the heart of Ukrainian statecraft, drafting secret treaties, managing diplomatic correspondence, and witnessing firsthand the growing encroachments of the Tsardom of Muscovy on traditional Cossack liberties. Under the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654 and subsequent treaties, Ukraine had entered into an alliance with Moscow, but with explicit guarantees of its autonomy, legal system, elected hetmans, and independent foreign relations. However, Tsar Peter I viewed the hetmanate not as a sovereign ally, but as a provincial borderland to be centralizingly absorbed into his growing Russian Empire. As Peter stripped away Cossack rights, forced Ukrainian regiments to build canals in Petersburg's swamps under horrific conditions, and imposed ruinous taxes, discontent reached a boiling point. When the Great Northern War broke out between Sweden and Russia, Mazepa made a fateful decision. In 1708, he allied Ukraine with King Charles XII of Sweden, aiming to break free from Moscow's subjugation. Pylyp Orlyk stood by Mazepa, drafting the diplomatic manifestos that explained Ukraine's right to resist tyranny. But the campaign ended in disaster at Poltava in July 1709. The Swedish-Ukrainian forces were shattered, and thousands of Cossacks fled south into Ottoman-controlled territory, establishing their camp at Bender. When Mazepa died in exile in September 1709, the Ukrainian political elite found itself in a desperate position. The Cossack tradition demanded the election of a new hetman. But the Cossack officers and the Zaporozhian Cossacks, the fierce, egalitarian warrior brotherhood of the Dniester Cataracts, were deeply concerned about the concentration of power. Previous hetmans, including Montesquieu, had often ruled with autocratic tendencies, relying on wealthy elites and ignoring the traditional rights of the Zaporozhian post. As the Cossacks prepared to elect Pylyp Orlyk as Montesquieu's successor, a fundamental debate erupted. The Zaporozhian Cossacks, led by their ataman Kost-Hordienko, along with senior military officers, insisted that no new leader should ever hold absolute authority again. They argued that the tragedy of Poltava and the loss of their homeland were warnings against unbridled autocratic rule. Pylyp Orlyk did not resist these demands. Instead, drawing upon his deep knowledge of European natural law, Polish parliamentary traditions, and ancient Cossack customary rights, he synthesized these ideas into a single, cohesive legal framework. On April 16, 1710, Orlyk was elected hetman, and on the very same day, he swore a solemn oath on the newly drafted constitution. The document was written simultaneously in two languages. Old Ukrainian, for internal governance and domestic legal clarity, and Latin, the international language of European diplomacy, so that foreign monarchs could read and recognize the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. The constitution of Pylyp Orlyk consisted of a comprehensive preamble and 16 detailed articles. Its opening lines were revolutionary for their time, establishing a historical narrative of Ukrainian statehood that traced its roots back to the medieval realm of Rus, while declaring that freedom was an inalienable right granted by God to all nations. First and foremost, the Constitution established the principle of limited government and the separation of powers. Decades before European Enlightenment thinkers popularized the concept, Orlyk's constitution created three distinct branches of governance. The executive power was vested in the hetman. However, the hetman was no longer an absolute ruler. Article 6 explicitly stated that the hetman could not make major foreign policy decisions, spend state funds, or appoint senior officials without the consent and counsel of the General Council. The legislative branch was embodied by the General Council, a parliament that was mandated to convene 3 times a year, at Christmas, Easter, and the Feast of the Intercession. Crucially, this parliament was not just an assembly of wealthy nobles. It included the senior officers, the colonels of each regiment, representatives from the Zaporozhian host, and delegates elected from towns and ordinary Cossacks. This gave the Ukrainian parliament a remarkably broad representative base for the early 18th century. Perhaps the most groundbreaking innovation was Article 7, which established a fully independent judiciary. It explicitly stripped the hetman of judicial authority. If an officer, a Cossack, or even a commoner was accused of a crime or treason, the hetman was strictly forbidden from punishing them personally. Instead, all cases had to be tried by an independent general court. Furthermore, the hetman himself was subject to the law. If he violated the constitution, the senior officers and the council had the legal right and duty to reprimand him publicly. Beyond political architecture, the Constitution of 1710 demonstrated a profound concern for social justice and economic fairness, topics rarely addressed in European legal documents of the era. Articles 10, 11, and 12 focused directly on protecting the poor, the peasantry, and ordinary townspeople from economic exploitation. During previous decades, local colonels and wealthy landowners had imposed arbitrary taxes, forced peasants into unpaid labor, and seized land from Cossack families while their men were away at war. Orlyk's constitution put an end to these abuses. It abolished illegal fees and extortion by local officials, protected the land rights of Cossacks, and exempted Cossack widows, orphans, and families of active soldiers from state taxes and compulsory labor. It also protected town merchants and craftsmen from unfair monopolies, ensuring free trade and economic stability. Additionally, the Constitution addressed the territorial integrity and religious sovereignty of the state. It defined the borders of Ukraine, demanding the return of territory seized by Muscovy and Poland. It also declared that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine should be freed from the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate and restored under the direct authority of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. a move that anticipated modern geopolitical and religious struggles by over 3 centuries. Though the Constitution was solemnly adopted, putting its visionary principles into practice across the Ukrainian homeland proved to be an uphill battle against the shifting tides of European empire. In 1711, Pylyp Orlyk launched a major military campaign to liberate right-bank Ukraine from Russian occupation. Supported by Swedish advisors, Crimean Tatar cavalry, and Zaporozhian Cossacks, Orlyk's forces swept through the region, warmly welcomed by local populations who swore allegiance to the new constitution. For a brief period, the constitution was enacted in several liberated towns and regiments. However, geopolitics quickly intervened. The Crimean Tatars broke ranks and began looting local villages, causing morale to collapse, while a massive Russian army advanced. Orlyk was forced to retreat back to Bender. When the Ottoman Empire made peace with Russia at the Treaty of the Pruth, and Sweden subsequently withdrew from the war, Orlyk found himself permanently exiled from his beloved homeland. Yet, Pylyp Orlyk refused to surrender. For the next 3 decades, he embarked on one of the most remarkable diplomatic epics in European history. Leaving his family behind in Sweden, where they lived under the protection of the Swedish crown, Orlyk traveled across Europe as a diplomatic envoy for a nation that existed only in the hearts of its exiles and the pages of its constitution. He corresponded with kings, prime ministers, and cardinals. He held audiences with King Charles XII of Sweden, King August II of Poland, and representatives of King Louis XV of France. In every capital he visited, Orlyk presented his diplomatic manifestos, arguing that a free, independent Ukraine acting as a constitutional buffer state was essential for the balance of power and permanent peace in Europe. His life in exile was filled with immense hardship. Russian agents tracked his every move, attempting to kidnap or assassinate him. To escape capture, he lived under assumed names, moved constantly through Ottoman lands, and spent years under virtual house arrest in Thessaloniki. His personal diary, the Diarium Commercialium, kept over many years, reveals a man of unshakable faith, profound intellect, and deep personal loneliness, longing for his family and his homeland. Pylyp Orlyk passed away in exile on May 24, 1742, in the city of Jassy, in modern-day Romania, at the age of 69. He died in relative poverty, never having seen his homeland free. Yet history has a way of vindicating true visionaries. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, international scholars re-examined the 1710 Constitution of Bender. What they found astonished the academic world. The Constitution of Pylyp Orlyk was not an isolated anomaly, but a crowning achievement of Eastern European republicanism. It synthesized the ancient democratic traditions of the Zaporozhian Cossacks with the sophisticated principles of European Enlightenment philosophy. By establishing the rule of law, the separation of powers, an independent court, and protections for social rights long before these ideas became standard in Western Europe, Pylyp Orlyk proved that Ukraine was an integral, pioneering part of European constitutional history. Today, the original Latin copy of this legendary document is preserved with honor in the National Archives of Sweden in Stockholm, while the old Ukrainian manuscript rests in Moscow archives as a silent testament to a stolen legacy. Pylyp Orlyk's life was defined not by the territory he ruled, but by the ideas he stood for. He showed the world that a nation is not defined merely by military conquest, but by its commitment to justice, freedom, and the rule of law. More than 300 years after it was signed on the banks of the Dniester, the Constitution of Pylyp Orlyk stands as an enduring monument to human liberty, a testament to a man who, in the darkest hour of his nation's history, dared to draft a blueprint for a free and constitutional future.